Thank you. My name is Courtney Welton-Mitchell, and I'll be presenting today on a variety of topics in an attempt to contextualize some of what you've seen. I'll be speaking about social, psychological, and cultural factors. I'm a social psychologist. I'm affiliated with the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado, and I also have an affiliation with the Humanitarian Assistance Program at the University of Denver. This presentation also represents contributions from my colleague, Rubina Awale, who's with Transcultural Psychosocial Organization in Nepal. So I'll attempt to touch briefly on a variety of different topics, a little about the assessment methods, disaster attributions, mental health and coping, social support, looking at cohesion and conflict, remittances, remuneration, and livelihoods, relief aid mechanisms, socio-political issues, gender, caste, ethnicity, language, and then summary and suggestions for future research. So basically, any and all social science topics I could fit into this presentation. So we actually covered, Rubina and I, interviews, about 80 interviews in 5 districts. And primarily these were informal interviews with community members, government officials, and relief agency staff. And one of the first things that we were interested in is understanding how did people explain why the earthquake happened. So a number of people explained to us, and this was a very consistent response, that they felt that people had lost the path of religion or dharma. They felt that the gods were angry. They felt in some cases that there had been a lack of proper site selection and preparation, primarily with Brahmin priests, and that's for both residential and business facilities. And interestingly, they also talked about some of the structures, some of the sacred structures that were unharmed. So places like Kathmandu Durbar Square, we saw a number of the structures coming down, but the Kumari Palace, the Kumari is known as the living goddess in Nepal, her palace was still standing. Also, Pashupatinath, which is essentially a temple complex dedicated to Lord Shiva, was still standing. And so this was notable to people that the gods had protected these structures. We also were interested in understanding to what extent people felt that another disaster was imminent, whether it were to be continued aftershocks that, of course, were occurring, another earthquake, or the associated landslides or other events, and to what extent people might be actually preparing, doing some disaster preparedness. A number of people told us, yes, they were very fearful. They felt the risk for additional disasters was quite high, and they were engaging in a variety of disaster preparedness behaviors, but the most common of which was actually religious ceremonies, or puja. So puja is the act of showing reverence to a god, a spirit, or another aspect of the divine. In Nepal, it's typical to provide offerings to fruit, rice, offerings of fruit, rice, flowers, prayers, and songs. Most people in Nepal are Hindu. There are a number of Buddhists as well. People typically might practice a mixture of both. Some of the religious ceremonies included Graha Shanti or Chama Puja, and when we translate this, this actually translates to a forgiveness ceremony. And this is a comment from a gentleman in one community that there were 250 community members engaged in this ceremony. It had happened about 2 days before we spoke to him, and he said, after the puja we were content, it helped, and now we're less fearful of aftershocks. Now, I don't want to paint a picture to suggest that everyone or even the majority of people in Nepal only believe in these types of attributions and don't believe in what we might think of as scientific explanations, but I think what's actually common in Nepal is for beliefs to coexist. So, for example, people might believe that the plates under the earth are moving, but that the gods had something to do with that process. Now, one of the reasons I'm interested in some of these questions is around disaster preparedness behaviors. And people do seem to be receptive to disaster preparedness. So some of the attributions about the gods being angry don't necessarily prevent people from engaging in a variety of types of preparedness activities that can include things like, retrofitting or securing homes or stockpiling goods. In fact, in Nepal, there are various stories about the gods help those who help themselves. And so it seems to be the case that these types of stories help reinforce this notion of personal or community responsibility for preparedness. Now, The context of Nepal is such that fatalism is actually still quite prevalent, though. So I've included this slide and this quote to just illustrate this. So this is an image of a Tamang woman, and this is a quote from her in Bimdunga, and this is on the outskirts of Kathmandu along ridgeline where most of the residential structures were destroyed. And she's actually rebuilding, along with other community members, in this area that is prone to landslide risk. They were told by the army to evacuate, but in fact, people are staying and rebuilding. And she said, no matter where you go, if it's written in your fate to die, you will die. To touch briefly on mental health and coping, a number of organizations have been involved in mental health assessments, notably International Medical Corps, and this is a chart pulled from one of their assessment documents, basically emphasizing that people are really experiencing, even months after, certainly in the immediate weeks after the earthquake, but this has continued, they're experiencing a number of stressors related to difficulty fulfilling their basic needs, concerns about livelihood, disruptions in social networks, all contributing to psychological distress. Now, this is actually consistent with what we heard when we talked to members of communities. People explain to us symptoms of sadness and crying and hopelessness that we think of typically as associated with depression. But in fact, they went on to explain that this is something that they felt was interfering with their ability to harvest and to rebuild. They also talked about anxiety over disruptions in the harvest cycle, lack of livelihood opportunities, and the potential impact on their children's future. People shared with us intrusive memories, so repetitive memories, or in some cases flashbacks around being buried in rubble. We spoke to a number of people who were buried, at least in the immediate aftermath in the rubble, and then either dug themselves out or were rescued by community members. Re-experiencing, yes, aftershocks are continuing, but people were having a difficult time being aware of, is the ground moving, is it not moving, feeling that the ground was constantly moving, sleep difficulties, alcohol abuse, irritability, fear. As I shared, spiritual practices appear to be playing an important role in coping. This is an image of a local temple. You can see some of the damage. And also to the left, there's a private shrine of a Brahmin family. And this is, both of these are in heavily damaged areas in Ramkot on the outskirts of Kathmandu. When I talk about reframing, what I mean is that going back to this community along the ridgeline, where nearly all of the residential homes were destroyed, there was only one injury. People were actually working in the fields. The children were gathered in one building, but the roof came off and the walls held. So I think that, when we wanted to talk to people about how they were doing and how they were coping with the loss of their homes, most of the time they wanted to redirect that conversation and tell us, well, our lives were spared. This is really incredible. I mean, look at the destruction, and we're alive, and our children are alive. So gratitude for having been spared. I want to move on to speak a little bit about social support, cohesion, and conflict. The New York Times and others have written pieces on the spirit of volunteerism in Nepal, and I think that it really was quite striking how some communities came together and helped one another in the aftermath of the quake. This is just a working hypothesis because we didn't look at a random sample of communities or individuals within a community, but it did appear to myself and Rabina that this sort of cooperation was more common in ethnically homogenous rural communities, so I think that's something to consider. We certainly have lots of evidence of local business leaders, religious groups, and other community members pitching in the early aftermath of the earthquake. I visited one community where I've done research historically in Nepal. It's a squatters settlement along the banks of the Bagmati, and this is as marginalized a community as I can imagine, and I've been working in Nepal on and off since 1998, and I went to go see how they were doing, and instead they told me, we are actually fine. We've been helping other people. They had been collecting money and letting people stay with them in their community. So this was, again, really quite striking. Now, that having been said, we did hear about conflict in communities that, again, a working hypothesis, semi-urban, possibly more common among mixed ethnicity and caste groups, but conflict over relief aid that was coming in, jealousy regarding distribution, previous conflicts being seemingly exacerbated, like conflict over water use. a lot of the temporary shelters and tents were erected on land that's typically farmed. And so as it became clear that people weren't going to be able to move back into their homes immediately, and that they might be in these temporary structures for a longer period, there became some conflict and tension around the landowners being able to access and farm that land. I think it's important to mention that Nepal is incredibly dependent on money coming in from foreign workers. This is pre-earthquake. So remittances make up 29% of the gross domestic product. For Nepal, it's number 3. This is data on the bottom for 2013, number 3 in the world in terms of the countries most dependent on remittances. Now, we don't have a lot of hard data yet, but early reports comparing the months in the aftermath of the quake this year to last year indicate that there's been a surge 35% in remittances in the aftermath of the quake. And we already had this pattern in Nepal of young men leaving. Certainly young men migrate out from the villages to the urban areas for work, but also they tend to leave to places like India, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Malaysia. So I think this is a trend to continue to watch. Remuneration, the government does have a provision to pay people for damaged homes and for lost loved ones, but I was actually somewhat surprised to find that fairly consistently when we spoke to community members, they shared with us that they didn't feel that they would be able to recover those funds. They didn't trust the government, they felt they didn't have the appropriate paperwork or documentation or political connections. This is a quote pulled from one of the interagency documents that I referenced earlier around mental health issues, just to sort of think about the implications of out-migration from some of these hardest hit areas. The notion that those left behind will be in charge of rebuilding. The burden of rebuilding will be placed upon women, adolescents, the sick, the elderly, because many healthy young adult and middle-aged men are not in rural communities. I think that when we think about livelihoods, it's interesting to me that there are clearly a number of livelihood disruptions, but there are also some livelihood opportunities. Disruptions include, there was very significant loss of livestock on which many Nepalese families are dependent. It impacted the harvest season, so late harvest and planting, and some concerns about crop yields this year as a result. Decrease in tourism. Nepal is very dependent on tourism. And a lack of available goods for small shop owners. Some of the factories weren't able to make goods. However, relief and recovery jobs with humanitarian aid agencies have surged in the aftermath, and a number of those agencies are hiring locals, and also work clearing the rubble for unskilled day laborers. So I think that it's interesting to think about these kinds of dynamics in the aftermath. Touching briefly on the relief aid mechanisms, we have something called the Humanitarian Cluster System that was introduced in 2005. It's a mechanism to essentially get the government, the international agencies, and the local agencies to coordinate within a sector, say healthcare or shelter. And so for example, and there are 11 sectors in the cluster system. For example, if we look at the shelter cluster, the government of Nepal has completed a post-disaster needs assessment. And this outlines the long-term housing recovery plans. And that plan, in theory, assuming the finances are there and that things can be managed appropriately, will be supported by 30 partner agencies, 30 international and local agencies with disaster and reconstruction expertise. So it will be interesting to watch how this unfolds. Of course, we also heard about a number of concerns from communities regarding this rebuilding process and local politics, conflicting disaster response and recovery plans. Community members told us they were highly suspicious of politicians and felt that they were capitalizing on this for their own ends. As I mentioned, some concerns about relief aid materials and fairness of distribution procedures and whether or not there was discrimination. A number of humanitarian agencies and human rights organizations have been calling attention to what appeared to be caste-based discrimination in the aftermath with relief supplies, in part because they're disseminated by local government officials that represent the dominant caste groups. And some of the caste groups that had the greatest impact, like the Tamang communities, are not part of those political structures. And of course, as you saw from some of the topography and other presentations, it's very difficult to access a lot of communities. So getting relief aid materials in is happening. For example, the World Food Program, I think they're employing over 4,000 porters to get into the remote villages, and of course, helicopter deliveries, which are very expensive. In wrapping up, I want to mention that Nepal is really only recently recovering from the history of a civil war. They also have had no formal constitution since 2006. There's a new draft that is actually, a lot of people feel like, was pushed through in recent weeks because of the international attention in the aftermath of the earthquake. It has not been accepted yet. It's under discussion, but it's creating a lot of controversy and political protests. And there's some concerns that the earthquake and the aftermath could further destabilize the political situation in Nepal. In part, if the government is seen to not have responded appropriately or ongoing concerns about the constitution. This is just a slide to emphasize there are 102 caste ethnic groups in Nepal. 123 languages are spoken. This is a very small country. This kind of cultural diversity is obviously a potential strength and also a potential challenge in terms of politics, coordination, relief efforts, and recovery. So in summary, I think there's a couple things that I'd just like to highlight. Disaster attributions should be considered in preparedness and rebuilding. Mental health should be addressed. We actually have 2 grants, primarily funded by DFID, British Government, and Wellcome Trust, to look at disaster mental health issues in Nepal. This is actually pre-earthquake, and then we received another one post-earthquake. And we have some preliminary data. These are longitudinal RCTs, so we won't have all the data for a while. But some preliminary data that we have does suggest that if you include an emphasis on mental health and disaster attributions in a standard disaster preparedness curriculum, you can actually increase behavioral engagement in disaster preparedness activities. So I think that that's something we're particularly interested in. So over the long term, I would just leave us with this question: how might some of the sort of myriad of social, cultural, and psychological issues that I've raised influence preparedness, recovery, and rebuilding in the coming months? Will we see what Brett referred to and others have noted as this build back better notion, or will we just see people replicating ancestral homes, reusing the same inadequate materials, adding on to temporary shelters that were hastily assembled for monsoon? Nepal is in the middle of monsoon right now, and the monsoon started shortly after the earthquake. This is my reference slide if you'd like more information on any of the issues I've touched on. And I just want to leave you with this acknowledgement slide. Thank you so much to EERI, NSET, the Natural Hazards Center, and so many of those in Nepal who contributed.